the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, this is NATO 2020, a new podcast series pitching fresh ideas for the world's oldest military alliance. I'm your host, Terry Schultz. I'm a freelance journalist in Brussels, and I've been covering NATO a long time, so I know a lot about how the alliance has been doing things, but this series is about how it could be doing things better. The Atlantic Council commissioned a series of 20 recommendations as to how the 70-year-old alliance could freshen up a bit heading into the next decade. Some of these are ideas we've heard before, and some are brand new. All of them are aimed at making NATO more responsive and resilient to the threats that definitely get more creative all the time. So I'm going to be digging into these ideas with their authors. And in this episode, the recommendation is that NATO should christen a carrier strike group. The author, Michael John Williams, is an associate professor of international affairs and director of international relations at the Maxwell School for Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. That is a mouthful. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Transatlantic Security Initiative right here in the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. So, Michael, now that I got through that very long detail of where you work and where you write, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Terry. It's a pleasure.
All right. So I have to admit from the beginning that this recommendation is one that I haven't heard a lot about here at NATO, which is not to say that they're not talking about it, but it's simply something that isn't in the common parlance of what we talk about or what we ask about. And so I was very interested, and I had to learn a lot and I had to study a bit. So let's start this off with you fleshing out why you think NATO needs a carrier strike group, which we will mercifully shorten to CSG for the rest of our show here. What kind of capabilities would it give the alliance that it doesn't already have? I mean, are people really, clamoring for this?
Okay, so let's back it up a little bit and come from where I was thinking about this to begin with. I mean, first of all, the idea is to try and be provocative and innovative, which this idea builds on a very long history of cooperation, in particular between the British and the French, which for a decade have been working on increasing military integration and naval capacity building in a variety of forms. And so the Lancaster House treaties, as they've known. So it's already been out there. But I also come as someone who has spent the majority of his adult life still at the moment in Europe. So I lived in London for a decade. I lived in Germany for about 3-4 years. So I have a different appreciation for how Europeans view things versus how Americans view things. And then I think we have to factor in the political world, which is, under the last administration, the Trump administration, NATO has really come in for a lot of bludgeoning on defense expenditure, on investment, et cetera. Now, this is not necessarily new, right? This has been a critique for pretty much as long as the alliance has been in existence.
For sure.
It's a reoccurring theme, right? As any old NATO hand, as you and I both know, and most people are listening to this podcast, this is always a tension. It became more acute following the end of the Cold War when European militaries cashed in on sort of the peace dividend of the Cold War, right? But the U.S. was always in a better position because we've maintained expeditionary forces throughout the Cold War. See, the Europeans only had to defend European territory long enough against a Soviet attack for the Americans to get there. The American forces and our Canadian friends had to be able to get there across the Atlantic. Okay, we had some forces stationed in Europe, particularly in Germany, but those were really basically a tripwire, right, to sort of stave off the initial attack and to call for more reinforcements. So we've always had that expeditionary capacity, which includes, of course, among other things, several carrier strike groups, right? And so when we talk about this debate, there's been a long-standing discussion about whether or not the level of investment in European militaries is enough or not. And there's this whole 2% sort of benchmark, which I think a lot of NATO people would say really isn't the greatest benchmark.
And we talk about that. We talk about that in another one entire recommendation. And so one show is about whether the 2% is still a worthwhile benchmark at all.
And and a lot of people say it's really not, right? You can hit that 2% in a variety of different ways. And so for me, what it came down to when I was thinking about, and when Chris Guluba approached me about thinking about NATO innovatively, is essentially like we're really talking about capability, and we're really talking about signaling and signs. Okay, And so for me, that came down to an idea of one, what can NATO Europe allies do, meaning all the allies outside of Canada and the US, to show their commitment, right? Because that's what a lot of it comes down to. And I mean, again, to backpedal a bit, I spent a year working in Germany as a Bosch fellow. And so during that time, I was in the Ministry of Defense for a year and at Airbus Military in near Munich. And what was fascinating to me was the extent to which, and this is just built on other years in Europe, that European allies were content to remain dependent on the United States capability, but not on each other. And this obviously has to do a lot with European politics, which is probably—
What year was that? What year was that? Because that would still be true.
Another podcast. Oh, that was 2012, 2013, but not exactly. Not much has changed. And it hadn't changed then. And what I was thinking of at that point, I was thinking of Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio. Not in my wildest dreams could I have imagined Donald Trump would come along and be president and say the things and do the things he has done. But the fact of the matter is, pre-Trump and post-Trump, those realities remain. And so what American politicians need to see, and what the American public need to see, and also what the United States really could use operationally, is capability, right? And so in this sense, I thought, given that the British have these aircraft carriers, which they have invested a tremendous amount of money in, and have, for all sakes and purposes, no offense intended, gutted the rest of the British military for the sake of procuring, how could they best be utilized, right? Especially in a Europe that is post-Brexit, right? And in a world—
I would say a Britain that's post-Brexit.
Well, now Britain is post-Brexit, but also Europe. And unfortunately for the European Union, Britain took roughly a third, if not more, of the real military capability with it.
Well,
right?
The naval capabilities especially.
Yes, especially. And so the idea, and I was very much opposed to Brexit, just to be on the record there. I don't think it makes a lot of sense, but we are where we are. And so how could then we take advantage of these assets in combination with thinking about NATO and European security and defense more broadly, and signaling a real contribution, right, to alliance effectiveness. I think it's especially, it's operationally, I think it makes a lot of sense, but also it's a potent symbol, right? And a lot of times carrier strike groups are about the symbolism. When the U.S. sends a carrier strike group towards Taiwan, right, through the Taiwan Straits, it's not because they really want to fight a battle on the Taiwan Straits with the carrier strike group. It's actually not a good idea, but it's the symbolism of it. And I think the symbolism of a very tangible asset that is sovereign but is under a NATO hat has a lot of value.
Well, there are a lot of the questions that I was going to follow up with are there in your opening argument here. For one thing, which NATO allies could muster right now, besides the U.S. and now we should point out the U.K., a carrier strike group, because the U.K.'s just became operational just within the last few days. And so, are there, if NATO was going to have one of these, and I don't think you yet answered the question of whether NATO actually wants one, would it be able to cobble this together, or would basically the US or the UK have to, put together large parts of their own capabilities in order to create a NATO carrier strike group? So those two questions, is this something that NATO thinks it needs, or the US thinks it needs, or just the UK thinks it would be handy, or are the rest of them? Does Estonia care about this? Does Portugal care?
Sure. Great question. So first question, does NATO care? Well, the question is, who's NATO, right? NATO is obviously an assemblage of all of the allied states, and that gives us a number of competing interests and competing drives and demands. I would say that in this sense that, and I've had many discussions with European colleagues about what does the United States want, obviously the US being one of the most important, shall we say, allies in the alliance. Now, of course, I don't know exactly what the United States wants. That depends on a lot of things, right? Bureaucratic politics.
Ask after January 20th.
Well, I know many of those folks who are going in, so I have like an indication of what they may want. But even the previous administration, that Wes Mitchell, who was Assistant Secretary for Europe, is a great guy, very sound on Europe policy, and between where Wes Mitchell's thinking is and whoever may be the next, Assistant Secretary in Europe, Julie Smith or someone, there's not that much daylight, right? So I think what they really want is European ability to effectively contribute somewhere. Now, I don't think that American policymakers, particularly the policy wonks, are thinking that Europeans are necessarily going to stick their hand in the snowblower that is China in the Asia Pacific, right? But they would be possibly willing and able to do more in the European sphere of operations, which includes like the Mediterranean, right? And the Gulf. And that would free up U.S. assets elsewhere. So I think also when you look at the new U.S. fleet structure, right? So the U.S. is reintroducing, they announced in early December, the Atlantic Fleet, which disappeared in the early 2000s, which in itself is a vestige, right, of obviously the Second World War. That's to symbolize, in part, a renewed commitment to the Atlantic, the North Atlantic in particular, and vis-a-vis Russia. They're also reconstituting this. The Second Fleet is now going to be basically based dealing with Arctic, right, issues and sort of this sphere. And they're basically relabeling the First Fleet is going to become an Indo-Pacific Asiatic fleet, right? So you can sort of get an idea where the U.S. is thinking. And, actually a NATO carrier strike group could operate in the Indo-Pacific, in the Gulf, through the Med, and through Europe, right? And those are relatively non-thorny areas that would be a significant contribution and free up U.S. assets to pursue other projects.
But
this brings us to the second.
Okay, sorry, go ahead. Keep going.
Well, this brings us to the second question you have, which is about the actual capability and how it could be done. So,
and why we need it.
And why we need it. Well, why we need it is essentially that the U.S. is essentially becoming more and more pressed. And I think that also when you think of it politically, right, this is, again, politically a symbol to the United States and to politicians that might be rapping on the table, oh, our European allies are slackers. Here's a real, tangible, actual thing that can be used, right, globally, not just for posturing, for relief efforts, right? If there's a tsunami somewhere in the Indo-Pacific, if there's unrest and a hurricane hits in the Caribbean, and Haiti or elsewhere needs relief, right? These are things that carriers can do. The French have done them before. The Americans have. The Italians have, right? So there's a need for it. And the idea is it's a really physical, tangible asset that Americans can look at and be like, oh, wow, those are the Europeans there helping us out with a whole carrier strike group. Look at that. So I think that's part of, I think it's politically almost more important than it is I think it's as operationally important, to be fair. The U.S. is increasingly strained. As I just mentioned, it's rethinking its whole structure of where it's deploying and how it's deploying, and maybe having the ability to move stuff out of the Gulf, say, and maybe a little more forward into Asia, whereas in the Gulf, it's a little more policing, anti-piracy, stabilization operations vis-a-vis Iran, et cetera, right? That would probably be really key and useful for U.S. military planners, but also very, very useful politically to show, hey, look, hey, here we are, the Europeans, and Britain and our European friends working together within the NATO framework, which will make, I think, a lot of American policymakers happy. So the other issue, though, is who can do this, right? So there are 4 NATO countries that have aircraft carriers. The United States obviously has several. The Italians have a couple. The British have a couple now, and the French have the Charles de Gaulle. They've all, by the way, for the most part, made use of groups that are made up of other allies, right? So it's not the French have done operations with other allies before. It's not just this. This is not, again, a completely novel idea. I think it's a recycling of a good idea that kind of has been missed in the past, and also is really driven by the economics of the situation, which is that European militaries across the board, just like the U.S. to some extent, are strained financially. And the British have built 2 spectacular carriers, and they really are technological wonders. Their crew, they're so highly automated. The crew is around 800, which is extremely low, right, for the sort of weapon that they are. But the reality is that the Royal Navy doesn't have enough assets to continually field one at deployment. So they have essentially 6 destroyers in the Royal Navy, 13 frigates, and 6 fast attack subs. So that puts you around 19 surface vessels with 6 underwater, right? Then you have to, whenever you look at a number like this, you actually have to divide it by 3, and 2/3 is what you get, right? So if you have 3 submarines, let's say, or 3 frigates, you will have 1 that's deployed, you'll have 1 that's preparing to be deployed, and 1 that's in dry dock, being retrofitted, repaired, getting a new paint job, having a new radar system installed, right? I mean, these are important things. And so really out of 3, you've only got 2 that are capable of deployment, and 1's technically not deployed, right? So that's a rough figure to understand. So with 2/3 of those assets, the Royal Navy, basically, if it fields a carrier group, it's pretty much out of commission anywhere else, right? If it wants to send a vessel to the Falkland Islands, if it wants to send a solo patrol to the Arabian Peninsula, like that all stops, right? So the first carrier strike group that they're going to put together is supposed to go to Asia. It's going to be an entirely sovereign mission. It's going to have some Type 45s.
You're talking about the UK.
The British, sorry, yeah. So Her Majesty's government is going to put together a carrier strike group organized around the Queen Elizabeth. It's going to have a few Type 45s, a few frigates. It's going to have a surface supply ship. It'll have a submarine perimeter vessel. That's going to be a whole British affair, aside from U.S. Marine Squadron of the Joint Strike Fighter, because the buy rate, that's another thing, is that these carriers are already going to be international because they don't have enough Joint Strike Fighters to fly off of them. The buy rate is so low that they won't have enough to really complement the full complement of the vessel. So they're already traveling with U.S. Marines on board. And of course, the NATO Europe Strike Group could have U.S. assets or even partner assets, friendly assets involved. It could have an Australian frigate, right? It could have an Indian destroyer with it if it wanted, if that was something that partners wanted to have a Swedish destroyer with it. It doesn't have to be an allied vessel, but it's already going to have U.S. assets on its first deployment to Asia. But I think it's right and proper that the first one is 100% a British affair. They're rightly proud. It's been a lot of investment. But going forward, thinking about the utility of these vessels and also competing priorities within the British military establishment, right? If they want to field other things like ground troops and tanks and other assets, not to mention other parts of the Royal Navy that aren't always devoted to the carrier strike group, then they working with allies and NATO allies is a wise and sensible option.
Okay, but I can't help going back to the motivation, because that's going to underlie also the other kinds of questions that we would have to solve, like command and control, like, terms of deployment. How long can an allied government allow its assets to be on a NATO mission like this? But so if I don't hear people calling for this, I hear about wanting more air policing, things like this, because it's the countries. I mean, the countries with the loudest demands are, of course, the ones along the Russian border traditionally. That's why that's where a lot of the assets go. That's why you have the enhanced forward presence, the last really big, new initiative that got underway really quickly. And, people are very, very positive about it. And everybody feels like that's a useful, that's a useful endeavor. But, you don't hear calling for more of this. So tell me, what would it do? What would it accomplish? What needs does NATO not know it has at the moment that this would fulfill, so that you could sort of, I'm sure everybody would love to have it. Everybody wants more toys. Everybody wants more capabilities. But realistically, everybody would have to, unless you're going to do a, coalition of the willing on something like this, or coalition of the haves. How do you really get the ball rolling enough to put this together?
Yeah. So the NATO Carrier Strike Group would be a one-star command, and the idea is that it would be dual-hatted with the commander of the United Kingdom Carrier Strike Group, right? So a double hat command. It would exist within the existing Allied Maritime Command structure, which is MARCOM, and Naval Striking and Support Forces NATO, which is Strike for NATO, right? And so they would be those concepts within a UK Marine Forces command, functioning as a task group commander, essentially, right? And the idea is it would be based in the UK. You would definitely have to sort out, the idea would be that these assets would be assigned and wouldn't be able to be recalled right away.
Because that has been a problem, right?
That's been a problem, yeah, and that's something that would have to be hashed out in discussions, right? I could say you should do it. That would require commitment. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I mentioned in the essay that Germany can become a slightly more problematic ally, because the Bundestag has to approve everything. Maybe it could get away with approving a deployment, but that could be more difficult. So, but, I feel like an ally like the Dutch, the Danes, the Baltic countries, depending on what they were able to field, I really think it's probably mainly going to be the Dutch, the Danes, the United States, the French, the Italians, the Spanish, that will be engaged, perhaps the Germans. They should be able to come up with the gusto to allow it. Now, why does it matter? Well, first of all, you can use a carrier strike group actually has a lot of utility, right? From being a floating hospital in times of need to being a very mobile forward-based a platform of force projection. And I think when you mentioned, for example, oh, well, the countries on the eastern flank and worried about Russia, well, there's no reason why a carrier strike group can't be in the Baltic on rotation, right? And providing additional air policing and additional support and a very robust presence.
Now
right?
you get their
off
attention.
Off the coast of Kaliningrad, right? Well, and it's also a totally normal place. It's also it's a totally normal place for it to be. I mean, the Baltic Sea is surrounded by allied countries and Russia, but it's mainly allied countries. So it wouldn't be at all out of place to be there. But the point is, there you go. So there's plenty of support for allies on the Eastern Flank that are like, what does this do for me? At the same time, let's say there is a really difficult situation, hotting up in the Senkakus, right? Somewhere in the Asia Pacific region that the U.S. feels that it really needs to rush forces forward, and it wants to send a second carrier strike group and call away a detail from elsewhere. The Middle East. Well, Europeans could say, we're going to send, we'll send the NATO carrier strike group will go in, right, to fill that gap for security and policing measures, right, anti-piracy operations, whatnot, maintain stability. So there's stuff in there for larger allies. Let's say that there's a massive hurricane that whacks most of the Caribbean, and the French and the British are worried about overseas territories there and want to rush emergency relief to them. Well, that carrier strike group could go and provide hospital facilities and fresh water making facilities, right, and relief to those people in those affected countries. So there's actually a lot, and carriers have done a number of these missions, humanitarian missions too. So there's
those
three different
operations
things.
Normally go through the EU, though, if you're talking about Europeans solely.
They do. They do. Unfortunately, these carriers are owned by Great Britain, which is no longer a part of the EU. And, this is, again, something the European Union has to deal with. If I had a penny for every time I was asked to comment on EU NATO, I'd be a billionaire.
But maybe that's more motivation. Maybe that is, but that would change also the way that NATO is called into service, or into cooperation. If it doesn't happen so much, it has, and COVID-19.
Most notably, hurricanes in the United States, actually.
That is true. That is true. But in terms of humanitarian operations, not so much. But the pandemic has opened up a whole new way of thinking about this kind of thing. So, it has been using capabilities that it had that were not used for humanitarian or civilian operations so much until now. So, let me ask a couple of other things, and you've sort of alluded to it a couple of times. Is the push for this, although I'm not saying that this is the reason that you wrote about it, but would this be something that is, the U.S. telling NATO it wants done, obviously with a British push as well? Is this largely U.S. driven?
No one picked up the phone and said, "Hey, write this, Michael." To me, I just want to be clear, right? But I think from my point of view, it is something that would make sense from a U.S. point of view and politically for allies, because it's very hard then for senators, who want to be critical of NATO to say, "Oh, NATO does nothing," when it's fielded and, first of all, when allies are increasingly meeting their 2% commitment, just to note that, and that started before President Trump came to office.
I always say the same thing. Yep.
Same thing. Very important to note. That started pre-President Trump. I'm sure President Trump scared the bejesus out of NATO allies, and myself included in that. But importantly, I think this is a really strong symbol that, about cooperation. And again, it is outside of the EU. There's nothing to say, of course, that, this couldn't somehow be mimicked within the European Union. But for better or worse, Great Britain is no longer a member of the EU, and it has these incredible assets which we could do something with, and that they're going to have a hard time dealing with just on their own, regrettably, right? So,
but would it require new spending? You talked about some of the assets that allies already have. So would this require new spending by some of the sort of underspenders at the moment? And to help
theoretically, they already have. Great question. Theoretically, they already have the assets, right? The Dutch have their frigates and destroyers, and the Danes have theirs, and the Spanish have theirs, and it would be detailed. And they're running them, right? Their operational costs entailed. So it would mean well, maybe they don't run them to save costs, or they've detailed them to certain operations, but it would be reassigning them from a current mission or current operation to this NATO group, right? Which again, there's going to be national priorities. This is just like everything else with NATO. There are national priorities, then there are NATO priorities, then there are the major allies who are like kind of like, hey,
there
give
are
us
U.S.
a little more
priorities, and then there are U.S. priorities, and then
yeah. But I think right now, I think, well, first of all, I don't want to over egg the pudding. I would say that from the United States point of view, policymakers need to be very, 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 very concerned about how European allies view the United States. And the United States is increasingly viewed with skepticism and disbelief, and no longer necessarily seen as a cornerstone of stability. So I've said this for many years now. I'm of a certain generation, post 9/11 generation, that said the U.S. needs much less hubris in its foreign policy. And I would say that that's exceptionally true right now. And that you can just look to what Chancellor Merkel has said about the United States and Europe, and that, there's really a serious, and I would say well-founded concern regarding sort of future security arrangements and how dependable the U.S. is. So for the U.S. to just come on in and assume everything is back to business is, I think, a little worrisome. I think it's also fair to say that the Europeans really want Americans back in the game. They would like to see their old friend return again, maybe with a little more humility.
They're fully expecting to see that. They're fully expecting to see their old friend return.
They are, and they want that, and they also want
and
to
they will probably get
show. I think they will, based on the folks that are being chosen, like Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, and the stable of really great folks that are circling right now for jobs. I think they will get it, and I think that they're then also keen to show that we don't need to be bludgeoned over the head and have a trade war to work with our allies, right? And so this is a way for them to show that there's a demonstrable commitment to the alliance and alliance security that can be used in a multifaceted way. I think one of the things I really like about this idea too is that it's not just forward presence and battalions rotating on the eastern flank are just there. They're on the eastern flank, right? And like, bulking up NATO presence in the Mediterranean for a sort of like counter North Africa migration issues, right? And that's what it's just there, right? So what I like about this asset is it's globally deployable, and it's deployable to any one of NATO theaters that we currently know are of concern, such as the Med, the North Atlantic, the Baltic. It would be of great utility in a theater of concern that we don't know is a theater of concern. And as you well know, we've been through the whole Kosovo, never do that again. And then suddenly Afghanistan, and like, oh, we won't do that again, but you don't know. And what I like about a carrier strike group is both the offensive capability, the logistical capability, and of course the natural disaster relief capability. I think gives it a multifaceted platform that could be useful to a number of allies in a variety of mission contexts. And that's why it's not just for the United States or Great Britain, but for all the allies. It could be a really useful tool and a flexible one, much more flexible than most of the things that we have at our disposal.
Well, let's talk, and we're running out of time, but let's talk then a bit more about timing. Not only is it perhaps really useful timing that the Biden administration is coming in, and European allies will be looking for ways to be more helpful, looking for ways to sort of, as you say, go back to normal, in the sense that everybody's friends and everybody's fairly transparent, and nobody's expecting to be stabbed in the back. So there will be certainly a much more, I think, constructive attitude to start with. But what we often see with NATO is that it needs to feel a threat. The fire needs to get pretty hot before things move quickly. So is China enough? I mean, with the new reflection group paper, with the new understanding that, whoops, we missed a lot of decades, while China bought up some of our key assets. Is China enough of a concern, and would a carrier strike group be useful enough in that area that this would be the motivating factor? Is it enough?
Yeah. Is it enough? Well, I sure hope so. I think we have one primary concern that has three prongs of attack. And I think that primary concern is a liberalism. And the three prongs are essentially Hungary, Poland, which is obviously a very concerning issue, Russia, and then China. And China being perhaps the greatest of those three threats.
Well, Hungary and Poland not being dealt with at all at NATO. Completely other side of the city. Zero. No discussion.
Zero. And that's a real problem. And I think that the rot from within is a really big issue, which I'll leave to the side here because it's a little less related to what we're talking about. But I think there's one threat, which is illiberalism, right? And that's internally and externally. I also think we see it in the United States right now, quite frankly, right?
Well, let's not forget Turkey here.
And Turkey and the UK and Marine Le Pen in France and Alternative for Deutschland. I think that there is a real onslaught of the idea of against liberal democracy and the rule of law, and that we live in what Ulrich Beck called a risk society, and where everyone thinks they're an expert and they have an opinion. And it's frightening. And if you look at what happened here just the other day, it's the storming of the U.S. Capitol. And then with Ted Cruz going on to say, oh, well, 30% of Americans think the election was illegitimate, and so we should investigate. It's like, well, that's what they think. But the reality and the data, it's a little insane. So
but again, NATO really doesn't deal with those things. It will affect them, but it doesn't deal with it. And we get shut down when we ask questions about it.
Yeah, which is, and they're trying to keep it piecemeal. But I think I as being an external and a scholar, I'm going to just flag it. So more your question, which is about China and to, I would say, a lesser extent, Russia. I think those are both two very tangible threats. I think let me start with the lesser of the two. Russia has proven itself, unfortunately, to be an adversary, not a frenemy, not a friend who's disagreeable. As someone who started learning Russia in Crimea in the late 90s, spent quite a bit of time there, had always hoped for a more positive working relationship. It is very difficult to reconcile the last decade of behavior with anything other than highly problematic and basically an enemy. So how that's one issue that I think all the allies, obviously those on the eastern flank, are concerned with. But I think Americans and Germans and the French should be too, considering the amount of money that has come from Moscow to fund campaigns, apropos liberal political campaigns. And that's what the Russians are utilizing. I'd highly recommend work from Janusz Bershin's on hybrid warfare and stuff, to think more about that. With China, the issue is even bigger. The beginning of the outbreak with COVID, I thought about writing a piece for the Atlantic Council, which I didn't. I should have done, but was essentially when everyone was sort of screaming about the U.S. and our terrible response, quite frankly, to this disease. But the reality is, with the U.S., like it or not, and thus, at least for the time being, what you see is what you get, right? So we're basically a hot mess, but you see the hot mess. It's out there for everyone to observe because it's an open and transparent society. So when the U.S. Capitol was locked down and senators were locked in the well of the U.S. Senate, there were reporters reporting from there. They were told not to disclose, and where they were then ushered later on deep in the bowels of the building. But they were reporting on what was happening, right? We were getting a real perspective on the horrifying incident that was happening. America is a dumpster fire on full display. China, for example, in the days of the early COVID, was a dumpster fire not on full display. And so for those who have to pick between the United States and China, my message is very simple. Pick the dumpster fire on full display. I mean, it sounds terrible to say that, but the reality is, at least for the time being, this is still a transparent society, right? This is still a society where you can see and understand what's happening, where there is critical commentary, where there is pushback. This is not the case with China. And China represents an overarching threat to, some people hate the phrase liberal world order. I don't really know what else you want to call it, but they definitely represent a threat to the idea of liberal democracy and the rule of law and the idea of minority rights. And those are things that I consider very important, and I think many others would too. So, ultimately, China is a major threat, and that will require both Europe and the United States finding consolidated positions vis-a-vis trade issues, vis-a-vis intellectual property right issues, vis-a-vis territorial issues. I think it's very worrisome that, when the Philippines and China had a case at the court in The Hague, and the Hague court found for the Philippines, the EU's response was, we will study the findings, as opposed to condemning China. That's their own court, by the way, in The Hague, in the middle of Europe, right? So I think that not pushing back against this sets a precedent, especially a precedent that it's the U.S. versus China, which it's not. It's international law, right, versus China, right? The idea of building islands in the South China Sea, of pushing the territorial line further and further out. That's not the U.S. versus China. That's international law versus China, right?
So you're teeing up the argument that it is a big enough threat. I mean, is this what you're saying, that the European allies need to see China writ large, I mean, in many different ways, as a big enough threat to justify more investment in an idea like a carrier strike group.
They do. Look, I deep in my heart, I'm a diehard idealist, but unfortunately, I'm a tainted realist. I don't want to see any sort of war. I would much prefer that we work this all out peacefully and communicate, and it's a rivalry, and I hope that happens. I think it's an improbable war, as Christopher Coker mentioned. It's an improbable war, but it doesn't mean it's an impossible war. And I think that Europeans, more so than the U.S., but we're all a little there, are the frog in the pot that is being slowly boiled. And so you can look at what the Chinese did in Sri Lanka. You can look at what they've done in Greece vis-a-vis ports. You can look at a number of infrastructure assets the Chinese are accumulating, which is very worrisome. And it's not a great place, I suppose, to be stuck in the middle, but they are. And I'm obviously biased. You can listen to my accent, but, I think they're better being stuck on our side than on the other side. At the end of the day, when Americans always ask me, why, American policymakers, why should we support the Europeans? And yada, yada. I'm like, look, it's like, this is like a marriage. Like, we argue all the time, but we have the same values. Like, we are like Europe, the United States is a European country. Those are the ideals that inspire the creation of the country. And so ultimately, we need to hang together, or we will hang separately. And that's the reality of it. And I think Europeans are increasingly waking up to that. In the last couple of years, you've seen that, especially in Germany, which has been very, very reluctant to take positions, but recognizing the danger. And I think that all of that will help contribute to the idea of, for example, a strike group that might be more forward deployed than you could have imagined. I will tell you this, when I ended up in the middle of the 2000s in Afghanistan doing some stuff with NATO, I never expected to be with the Bundeswehr in the Hindu Kush when I started learning German in high school, right? Back in Southington, Connecticut. So you never know where you're going to find yourself. Yeah.
They wouldn't have known they would find themselves there.
No, I think and especially with the Bundeswehr speaking German, right? When, the Germans wrote checks for the first Gulf War, right? Which was widely considered a very legal and legitimate war, but the Germans wouldn't participate. And then you have Kosovo, and then you have Afghanistan. So who knows where we'll be? I think a carrier strike group provides a multi-purpose asset that everyone can get behind and would signal real commitment that a lot of Americans, both policymakers and citizens, need to see.
Well, that's about all the time we have for now, but it seems that many things are aligning toward good timing for this idea. The China threat, the Biden administration, the recognition by Europeans that they do need to do more, and they're looking for creative ways to do that. So maybe we'll see that. You think, give me, within the Biden administration, will this be a proposal, a full-blown proposal at NATO?
Well, geez, I hope so. I'll give some people a call. I would say that they wouldn't probably hate it. I don't know if it'll be a proposal or not. We'll see. We'll see where people land. But I definitely think that they're going to welcome any sort of allied contributions to capability development, and this would be one of them.
Well, now I know to listen for it. Thank you very much, Michael John Williams, for telling us more about your idea that NATO should christen a carrier strike group. And you can find all 20 ideas on atlanticcouncil.org, and tell us what you think on Twitter at #StrongerWithAllies. Thank you very much, Michael, and join me next time.